Berlin, the Big Easy, the Windy City. It goes by many names, but whatever you call it, it's a laid-back town of sandy beaches and carefree island living as far as the eye can see. But when the Templin Institute landed in this remote tropical paradise in October 2019, we weren't here for the famous river spree lobster or vanilla pineapple margaritas. No, we had come to attend PDXCon.
But while everyone else was busy waiting in line, we decided to hit the town, see the sights, and discover a little bit about a city that some have probably described as the Paris of Europe. Over the course of the week, we'd encounter some Russian tanks, defect to East Germany, swear fealty to the Kaiserreich, and then check out all the latest games and news from Paradox Interactive.
Our travels didn't end there, though. Like Boba Fett before us, we managed to pursue some Paradox staff back to their headquarters undetected. In Stockholm, aka Sin City, we snagged a private tour of the new offices before checking out a series of creepy robots, a bunch of guns, and a famously unstable Swedish warship. It was a thrilling trip of danger, deception, and DLC, in what we're calling Operation Platypus, Race to the Old World. By the time we arrived in Berlin, I had been awake for over 41 hours while Larissa resembled a walking corpse. The only cure was to sleep. Instead, we went to the German-Russian Museum. During World War II, this building was part of a Wehrmacht pioneer school, and on the 8th of May, 1945, it became the site where Nazi Germany officially surrendered to the Allies. We saw a ton of artifacts and exhibits from the war, but the heart of the museum was the surrender room itself. It's been preserved in its original state since the signing of the German Instrument of Surrender, which remains there to this day. Either that or it was a copy, I forgot to check. Right behind the museum was the highlight of the visit, some World War II-era Soviet tanks. It was a lineup of all the greats, an IS-2, ISU-122, Su-85, and a BM-13 Katyushka. See, there it is. And of course, there was a separate space reserved for the legendary Tu-34 right at the museum's entrance.
The next day, after a welcome and very much necessary rest, we made our way to Checkpoint Charlie. It seems we weren't the only ones who had this idea, as within a few minutes of our arrival, the place was overrun with tourists. Who could have predicted that? After trying in vain to get some footage of the checkpoint without strangers standing in front of it, our next stop was the Berlin Story Bunker. It displayed the history of the city from its founding in the 12th century to the modern day. All of it was housed in a World War II-era bunker, which they didn't allow cameras in, so you'll just have to guess what that was like. After walking down historic Unter den Linden and seeing the Berlin University, Opera House, and some nice statues, we ended up at the German Historical Museum. The collection housed here was unbelievable. Some highlights included a stained glass window depicting Wilhelm I, an absolutely enormous painting of the inauguration of Parliament in the Reichstag by Wilhelm II, a Wehrmacht flak cannon commonly known as an 88, and a Volkswagen Beetle. Video footage doesn't really do it justice, especially the footage we took because the first security person we ran into said we couldn't use our camera stabilizer.
We ended our second day in Berlin with a tour of the city's famous landmarks. The Berlin Victory Column, commemorating the Danish-Prussian War, the Soviet War Memorial in Tiergarten, and then of course the Reichstag. I can say absolutely that it did not disappoint. I always imagined it a lot smaller, so seeing just how big this building is in real life was pretty cool. We ended things with a visit to the Brandenburg Gate. The night we were there, video and images were projected on its surface. It was another tour through German history, presented on a very unique canvas. Crowded with tourists, though. It's weird how they kept having the same ideas as us. Earlier in the day, we had the great idea that it would be cool to get some footage of the Templin flag billowing triumphantly in the wind in front of the Brandenburg Gate. But, you know, not everything works out the way you hope.
And so, we finally arrived at the main event, PDXCon 2019. The convention was hosted within Rundfunk der DDR, now mostly known as Funkhaus, which during the Cold War served as the East German Broadcasting Center. The building is in a remote part of Berlin amidst the ruins of crumbling factories, and if mobs of post-apocalyptic warriors had emerged at any point, it would have definitely fit the atmosphere of the place. Thankfully though, there were only a few warbands in sight, and PDXCon was a real thing, not a convoluted trap meant to capture and study us. For those unaware, the convention is a 3-day celebration of Paradox Interactive's games, a place where they can announce new projects and expansions, where fans and developers can hang out, talk about video games, and the whole community can interact on a personal level. That's the marketing pitch anyways. And maybe the most rewarding aspect of PDXCon is that it's actually true.
It's kind of a diamond in the rough.
Yes.
Oh yeah. Whatever.
Even on the busiest days, with crowds of people flooding the space, Paradox developers were wandering around and chatting with anyone who struck up a conversation with them. Friday was the first day of PDXCon and limited to the press, VIPs, and miscellaneous people like us. Instead of the frenzied crowds and dramatic reveals we'd see over the next couple of days, there were roaming gangs of journalists taking in presentations of what Paradox was going to announce, what the major features of all the new games were, and taking questions. The whole space was absolutely spectacular. Funkhaus is such an incredible building, and seeing it lit up by thousands of colored lights with fog machines going off in random places really gave it this magical quality.
I think my favorite section was the city's skylines area. I dubbed it the chill zone, although I never actually took a moment to chill there, which I deeply regret. Another regret of mine was that there was a speakeasy hidden in the back of the building, which I didn't actually find until it had been closed down. Throughout the rest of the building, there were various stages set up for panels and events, a corridor filled with Paradox board games, and the community corner, where we had our own little booth right next to the Kaiserreich team. We weren't entirely sure what to do on this first day. We weren't journalists, and I'm not sure if we were technically allowed to attend the presentations that were happening, but that didn't stop us from trying. When nobody was looking, we even got to play a bit of Stellaris Federations before we got scared and bailed. Later, we tried to sneak into the Surviving the Aftermath demo session, but the guards caught us and we were exiled to the outside world. As a consolation prize though, we did get to try out Empire of Sin, the new 1920s gangster-themed strategy game from John and Brenda Romero. We weren't allowed to film anything, but I can reveal one key detail. A few months before, I'd complained on Twitter that the Canadian flag used in-game wouldn't be designed until 40 years after Empire of Sin took place. Wouldn't you know it, on the build we tried out, the design had been fixed to one period appropriate. #influencer.
Saturday was the big one. Crowds began to gather outside, even more smoke machines were turned on, and everyone got ready for the announcement show. Mark and I got some great seats. Actually, it was more of a concrete divider slab that we didn't so much sit on as stand next to. We could talk about all the announcements and reveals, but the most important thing to happen during the show was missed by almost everyone. The previous day, we handed out Templin Institute ribbons to all the Paradox staff to wear on their lanyards. We kind of figured they'd take them off before doing anything important, but nope. Our logo was featured prominently on the stage. We really should have included our name or something. We wasted a really good marketing opportunity. Of course, the biggest reveal took place at the end. As candles were wheeled out, a choir appeared amidst the swirling fog, and Crusader Kings 3 was officially announced. The atmosphere in that room was overwhelming, with 1,000 people shouting out, "Long live the king!"
The rest of the day was spent wandering across the show floor. We got to meet a bunch of people at our community booth, introduce ourselves to some fellow content creators, and I got to take part in the Stellaris Arc of Ascension game. Our friend Acebek was hosting and streaming the whole thing, and let's just say that I performed magnificently and won the whole thing. But don't look into that. Day 2 closed with the Paradox Awards, where members of the community were recognized for their achievements and contributions. In a major upset, we weren't even nominated, so next year, we'll need to do one of those for your consideration campaigns. After that, the stage was taken over by a few bands. Even as someone who only found out recently that music produced after 1989 even existed, it was pretty good. I mean, I had no idea what was going on. What's with that giant banana? I don't know. Nevertheless, it was a fitting end to the night.
The next day was the last of PDXCon, and filled to the brim with computers where anyone could play almost everything that was shown during the event. There were huge LAN games of Hearts of Iron 4, Europa Universalis, Stellaris, Crusader Kings 2, and if you wanted to play some Surviving the Aftermath in the wreck of an old car, you could do that, which is exactly what I did. There was also a huge Crusader Kings themed mega game that dominated the show floor. A place where various kings plotted their way to supremacy while being wary not to draw the ire of the Pope, or even death itself.
Overall, PDXCon was a fantastic experience. Being able to approach the developers of some of my favorite games and talk with them about their plans, inspiration, and whatever else was something I've never experienced before, and what really sets PDXCon apart.
While the convention was over, our trip still had a few days left to go. We ended up in Stockholm, having been graciously invited to check out Paradox Interactive's new offices. First though, we had to check out something everyone told us we needed to see. In 1628, the Vasa, what was to be the flagship of the Swedish fleet, took its maiden voyage out onto Stockholm harbor and immediately capsized and sank. Turns out, the King of Sweden kept on adding more and more cannons to the design, despite the engineer saying it would never float.
In the 1960s, the ship was recovered from its watery grave, and having been remarkably well preserved, is now on display at the Vasa Museum. Alongside some recreations of what the ship originally looked like, there was a lot of really interesting displays on both 17th century Sweden and the raising of the Vasa itself. I can definitely see why this museum is held in such regard. There's probably only a few places in the world where you can see a warship of this era preserved so well. This, though, was only the first on our list of stops.
Tekniska Museet is Stockholm's Museum of Technology, and while we were there, it featured a huge exhibit on robots, both real and fictional. Surprisingly, the scariest robots weren't those of the T-800 line that nearly exterminated humanity, but instead this robot comedian who did a pretty decent Humphrey Bogart impression.
Here's to looking at you, kid.
And this amorphous blob that just seemed to glare at you with its cold, dead eyes.
Of course, the reason we were in Sweden at all was to take a look at Paradox Interactive's new offices. Unfortunately, with most of the staff still recovering from PDXCon and not even fully moved in yet, there was only so much we could see. I'm gonna judge your, what is, you've got like 1 million of something in here. Is this left over from ParadoxCon?
Nope.
Okay. I don't know what to say about this. We were still able to meet with some of the Stellaris team and deliver some bribes, though.
Our fans, they'll just gotta remove from
Yeah.
there, and then it's actually.
The new office is really cool, with each floor themed around a different era: Victorian, World War II, and space, or the future, I guess. It's also mostly off limits for video, so this brief footage will have to do for now.
Getting the chance to fly to Berlin, attend PDXCon, and head over to Stockholm was an unbelievable trip. The Templin Institute has been privileged enough to start being invited to all sorts of remarkable events, and we're so grateful for these opportunities. If you enjoyed following along with our experiences in PDXCon and beyond, we'll be posting all future trip videos on the Templin archives. As always, you'll find a link in the description. Thank you for helping make this whole thing happen. We got some other trips and ideas lined up for the future, and we'll do our best to share what happens with all of you.